The final judgment day of the Lord is not merely an event. It is the moment that determines the fate of all souls. When the divine light shines upon the earth, the darkness of sin will be eradicated. The enormous chains and the inevitable punishments are all terrifying symbols of absolute justice. But will this judgment bring salvation to the righteous? Or is it the irrevocable destruction of those who have rejected God? It is a mysterious event that even those closest to the Lord could not predict. When Enoch witnessed the vision of the final judgment, he saw the devastation of a world being purified by the light of God. This day is not just an event. It is a grand affirmation of the Creator's power. In these moments, justice and punishment will show no mercy. The sinful souls, those who have rejected holiness, will face a dreadful fate, chains, invisible yet unyielding, binding them to eternal darkness. However, for the righteous, the day of judgment is when they will receive salvation, shielded within the absolute glory of the Lord. It is a warning to every soul. Justice never forgets, and salvation is given only to those faithful to God. If the information provided here has been valuable to you, share it with your community of believers. Support us by following, and leave a comment below to offer your feedback. In the book of Enoch, one of the most profound and chilling visions the prophet Enoch witnessed was the preparation of enormous iron chains in the heavenly realms, destined for the fallen angels and the wicked. These chains, immense and unbreakable, were not merely images of punishment but tools of divine justice, meant to imprison those who had defiled the earth and rejected the will of the Creator. So why did Enoch witness the preparation of these chains? And what purpose do they serve for the condemned? Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, was chosen by God to witness the sacred mysteries of heaven and earth. His visions were not ordinary dreams. They were divine revelations transcending the material world. Through these visions, Enoch saw the intricate structure of the universe, the fate of the fallen angels, the Watchers, and the final judgment they would face. The chains, as described in the book of Enoch, were an essential part of the punishment for these angels who had violated God's order by descending to earth and taking human wives. Their actions led to the birth of the Nephilim, a race of giants who brought chaos and violence to the earth. It is within this context that the chains were prepared. The first mention of these chains appears in the astronomical book, 1 Enoch 18:14, where Enoch sees the place of punishment for those who turn away from the light of the Lord. These chains, described as immense and unbreakable, were to be used to imprison the fallen angels and cast them into the abyss. These angels, once members of God's heavenly council, had been ensnared by the temptation of ambition and pride, leading to their rebellion against God's command. In their sin, not only was humanity harmed, but they sought to overturn the order of the cosmos. Therefore, the chains had been prepared to bind these beings eternally, beyond escape. When the judgment came, why chains? In the ancient world, chains symbolized restraint and imprisonment, reflecting an unchangeable fate. For the fallen angels, these chains were not only instruments of punishment, but also embodiments of divine power, a reminder of God's justice. They were forged to address a direct violation of God's eternal laws, with the sole purpose of preventing these rebels from causing further harm on earth. The book of Enoch affirms that these chains were prepared in advance, awaiting the moment when the angels would be judged. Enoch's vision is not merely a picture of punishment, but also a reflection of God's fairness and mercy. The chains were not only meant to punish, but also to restore order to the heavens and earth. Without them, the chaos wrought by the fallen angels and the Nephilim would never cease, and the balance of the universe would be destroyed. In his vision, Enoch also saw that the earth, once defiled by the monstrous beings and their deeds, would be cleansed, preparing for a new world. However, the significance of the chains extends beyond the punishment of the fallen angels. They symbolize the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between good and evil. When the chains were prepared, Enoch understood that the forces of darkness, no matter how powerful, could never escape God's judgment, no matter how widespread their influence or how much they had polluted the earth. These chains would be the final sign of celestial authority. They would ensure that the wicked could not evade justice and that the cosmic order would be restored. These very chains prepared to punish the fallen angels carry an important message for all of us. God's justice is not arbitrary but a fair, purposeful, and unchangeable process. These chains are not only for the fallen angels, but serve as a warning to all who live in sin. No one can escape the consequences of turning away from God. As we reflect on Enoch's vision, the question remains, are we walking on the path of rebellion, unaware that the chains of judgment are ready? The Book of Enoch is a warning to all who dare oppose the power of God, reminding us that His justice cannot be overturned. The chains have been prepared, and the time of judgment will come when no one can escape the punishment. In the Book of Enoch, one of the most mystical and epic visions the prophet Enoch witnessed was the sight of metal mountains, hard and indestructible objects, turning soft like wax under the intense heat of fire. This scene not only made a powerful impression about the might of heaven, but also served as an image of punishment and justice in the day of judgment of the chosen one. So, why did these metal mountains become fragile before the fire? And why did they soften like water? What significance does this hold in the course of God's judgment? The Book of Enoch describes a grand vision where angels and the condemned are forced to face the absolute power of God. In Enoch's vision, the metal mountains represent solid entities, symbols of firmness and endurance, values and powers that humans or angels believe will never be altered. These mountains are depicted as symbols of worldly powers or kingdoms, which presume themselves to be invincible and invulnerable. However, when faced with the fire of judgment, these mountains cannot withstand the heat of divine justice. Not only do they melt, but they also become soft like wax, easily molded and changed. The light from these flames is believed to symbolize God's boundless power, and it can melt even the hardest substances. In this vision, Enoch saw that when this sacred fire approached the metal mountains, they no longer retained their firm shape but became pliable, easily shaped, and entirely submissive to the will of the chosen one. These mountains, once symbols of strength and power, are now reduced to metal masses that can be bent to the will of God. This vision carries a profound meaning about the supreme and absolute power of the chosen one on the day of judgment. The sacred fire does not merely destroy the arrogance and might of God's enemies. It also weakens everything that humans and angels once believed could never be defeated. It shows that no matter how sturdy and solid the earthly world may seem, it will be consumed when it faces the justice and power of God. The story of these metal mountains melting before the fire also conveys the impermanence of earthly power. What humans or angels can build through strength, power, or pride will not stand when confronted with God's absolute fairness. Fire in Enoch's vision is the unyielding justice of the chosen one, which will burn away all wickedness, greed, and disobedience, no matter how hard these mountains may be. In the end, they must submit to this divine power. The metal mountains in Enoch's vision also represent the clear distinction between the righteous and the wicked. When the day of judgment arrives, the wicked will face the collapse of the solid structures they have built in their earthly lives. They will see their achievements and powers rendered meaningless as they are destroyed by the power of the sacred fire. In contrast, the righteous will be protected, and God's justice will make them steadfast like rock, unshaken by the storms of the world. The fragility of the metal mountains is also a reminder of humanity's helplessness before the infinite power of God. When confronted with the justice of the Chosen One, everything, no matter how grand or mighty, will be melted and shaped. This vision is a clear conclusion to the futility of worldly power when it does not follow God's ways. And ultimately, all will face one undeniable truth: the righteousness of God will always prevail. In the book of Enoch, there is a striking and symbolic image of the appearance of the Chosen One, a figure with a divine mission selected by God to execute judgment and deliver salvation for the righteous. The name Chosen One is not merely a title but a symbol of hope, salvation, and absolute justice. But the question remains: what change will the appearance of the Chosen One bring to the righteous and the holy in the world? In his visions, Enoch witnessed a future when the Chosen One would appear on earth to carry out God's justice. It is a grand and mystical image, beyond full expression in words, yet filled with strength and comfort for those who seek righteousness. When the Chosen One emerges from the heavenly kingdom, the righteous and the holy will experience a profound transformation in their lives. They will no longer have to live under the oppression of sin and injustice, but will be led into the light, where God's justice will be clearly manifest. Notably, the appearance of the Chosen One is not merely a symbolic event, but a time when the righteous will experience protection and renewal in their souls. In Enoch's vision, the righteous are described as those who are ready to inherit God's kingdom. When the Chosen One comes, they will be lifted up and will no longer endure the suffering of the world. The light of the Chosen One will illuminate their souls, filling them with hope and glory. Those who have lived righteously will see that all the trials, hardships, and suffering they have endured were not in vain. When the Chosen One appears, good and justice will be established on earth. The moral and spiritual values they have followed throughout their lives will be honored by God. A new life, full of peace and prosperity, will come to them as they are protected from evil forces and sin. The appearance of the Chosen One also plays a crucial role in the restoration of cosmic order. According to Enoch, in his vision, when the Chosen One appears, there will no longer be a distinction between the righteous and the wicked. Everything will be made clear and transparent. The righteous will be rewarded and honored, while the wicked will face eternal judgment. This distinction is the affirmation of God's justice, as the rebellious and sinful will no longer be able to exist in the light of the Chosen One. Moreover, the Chosen One brings not only judgment, but also absolute peace to the world. The righteous will be protected, no longer suffering from the persecution or injustice they once endured. The wicked will be punished, and cosmic order will be restored to its original state. This is not just a physical change, but a profound spiritual transformation. The righteous will no longer live in the darkness of anxiety and fear, but will live under the eternal light of God, a place free from suffering and division. The Chosen One will create a harvest of righteousness, where pure souls will be gathered into God's kingdom, while the wicked will be cast aside. This renewal will affect all people on earth, creating an entirely new world where justice and peace are the foremost ideals. Thus, the appearance of the Chosen One is not only salvation for the righteous, but also a turning point in the restoration of the natural order, bringing eternal peace and happiness to those who trust in and pursue justice. It is proof that God's justice will always prevail, and in the end, those who are faithful will be rewarded, living in His eternal glory. In Enoch's vision, a powerful and profound image was unveiled, revealing the division between righteousness and wickedness. This division is not a simple one. It is a divine process through which everything will be classified and arranged according to an immutable cosmic order. Two key elements stand out in Enoch's vision: wisdom and unrighteousness. These are not merely abstract concepts, but are actual entities with the power to manipulate and shape the fate of humanity. Intricately tied to God's final judgment, Enoch witnessed the appearance of wisdom as a majestic and all-encompassing force granted to the righteous. In Enoch's vision, wisdom is not just a gift, but a divine illumination given by God to help humanity understand the higher principles of the universe and their relationship with the Creator. Wisdom is not easily attained. Only those with pure hearts and a desire for righteousness can truly grasp it. It is a guiding light, a path of direction for those who walk in righteousness, helping them avoid the temptations and sins of the world. However, the appearance of wisdom is accompanied by the rise of an opposing force: unrighteousness. In Enoch's vision, unrighteousness is not merely the evil actions of mankind, but an invisible force that draws souls into darkness. Those ensnared by unrighteousness fall into a state of blindness, no longer able to discern right from wrong, becoming slaves to sin. Unrighteousness stands as a direct challenge to righteousness, corrupting humanity and robbing them of the ability to persist on the straight path. What is striking in Enoch's vision is the clear division between these two forces. When wisdom appears, it not only illuminates those who live righteously, but also purges the darkness of unrighteousness. The light of wisdom is like a great net, separating those faithful to God from those blind in their sin. Enoch saw that, in the end times, wisdom would stand on one side, and unrighteousness would be cast aside. The souls of the righteous will be saved, while the wicked will have no place in God's kingdom. A significant event in Enoch's vision is the great battle between the angels of light and the evil spirits of darkness, representing wisdom and unrighteousness. This battle takes place not only in the heavenly realms, but also impacts the earth, as every soul must face the choice between following righteousness or sinking deeper into the darkness of sin. The appearance of wisdom and the rise of unrighteousness are also signs of changes in the cosmic order. Enoch saw that at the time when the wicked are at their peak, wisdom would appear more powerfully than ever, signaling the end of the power of sin. Humanity will face the truth that unrighteousness cannot endure, and on the final day of judgment, only the righteous will enter the kingdom of God. According to Enoch's prophecy, the number of the righteous will be few, but they will stand firm, and salvation will come to them. Those who follow righteousness will be guided by wisdom and will live in eternal peace and happiness, while the wicked will be punished severely. This is Enoch's clear message. The struggle between righteousness and unrighteousness is not just a battle on earth, but an eternal conflict between light and darkness, between life and death. Enoch's vision is not merely a mystical scene, but a powerful warning to humanity. In today's world, the division between righteousness and wickedness remains a pressing issue. Wisdom continues to be the guiding light for those seeking salvation, while unrighteousness grows stronger, forcing humanity to choose between two paths: the path of wisdom or the path leading to destruction. At a time when all things in the world seem to be plunged into chaos, when wickedness increases and faith in God is tested, a great and inevitable event was foretold in Enoch's vision: the final judgment. This is not merely a prophecy, but a decisive event that determines the fate of all humanity. For Enoch and the righteous, the final judgment is a sign of deliverance and the culmination of a long journey in search of justice. Enoch, chosen by God to witness the mysteries, saw the appearance of the Chosen One, who would serve as the instrument of God's justice. In his vision, Enoch was taken into an eternal space where the souls of the righteous awaited. It is a place where there is no suffering, no darkness of sin. The Chosen One, with supreme power, will carry out the final judgment, clearly distinguishing between those who live in justice and those who pursue wickedness. The final judgment is not simply the end of all things, but the rebirth of justice. The righteous will be brought into eternal rest, where they will never again face sin or suffering. They will be rewarded for their faithful deeds, and the glory of God will shine upon them. Through the vision, Enoch saw that God's justice is unshakable, with no tolerance for those who have rejected him. For humanity, the final judgment is a great hope. It is the belief that, though sin may cover the earth, ultimate justice will prevail. Those who have lived by faith pursued righteousness and resisted the temptations of wickedness will be saved. They will live in a new kingdom where peace and holiness will reign forever. This judgment brings absolute fairness. There is no favoritism, no distinction, and no one can escape punishment if they have turned away from God. The images in Enoch's vision are not only terrifying but also bring great hope. The final judgment is an opportunity for the righteous to demonstrate their faith and receive the reward they deserve. At the same time, it is a warning to those who have lived in sin, reminding them that no one can escape God's justice. Enoch's vision delivers a clear message. At the appointed time, all things will be set in their proper order, and righteousness will triumph. Enoch's story of the final judgment is not just a myth, but a reminder to humanity of the importance of living rightly and faithfully before God. It is a promise of fairness and salvation for those who do not succumb to the temptations of the world. The final judgment is not only a punishment for sin, but also the opening of the door of hope for the souls that seek salvation. There is a particular image that Enoch witnessed: the ever-burning fire in the west, a symbol that not only reflects punishment and justice, but also holds profound implications about the eternal nature of God's justice. This fire, never ceasing, is not just a physical flame, but a living symbol of God's infinite power, continually shining to illuminate the darkest corners of the world, never to be extinguished, never to soften before sin. In the west, where the sun sets and darkness gradually descends, this fire ignites as a reminder that, even though the world may be consumed by the night of sin, God's justice will never waver. It is the unrelenting burn of this fire that led Enoch to realize that, regardless of the passage of time, justice will endure forever, steadfast like a flame that will never go out. Fire in the west represents not only God's punishment for the wicked, but also the relentless pursuit of justice. History has shown that righteousness is a recurring theme in Enoch's visions and prophecies. This fire, kindled by God's judgment, serves as proof of the powerful presence of justice in the world. When the fire flares up, Enoch witnesses the harsh punishments for those who have turned away from God, those who did not trust in his fairness. The evil spirits, the wicked souls trapped in the burning flames, have no chance of escape, for God's justice is unyielding. The image of the fire in the west carries a deeper, more mystical meaning. Enoch saw that this fire does not merely burn for punishment, but also to purify the world of sin. It is like a flood of fire, cleansing all traces of iniquity, restoring all things to a state of purity, ready for a new future. This fire, with its unstoppable power, awakened in Enoch the faith that God's justice will never be destroyed, no matter how many evil forces seek to oppose it. The relentless pursuit of justice through this fire also reflects the reality that God's justice never overlooks. The evil spirits, sin, and wickedness, no matter how stubborn they may be, cannot escape the sharp gaze of justice. The fire represents God's perseverance, tirelessly fighting to maintain order and purity in the world. It is a continuous pursuit, unceasing, a reminder to every soul that no one can escape his fairness. In Enoch's vision, the fire of the west is not merely an image of judgment, but also of rebirth, a promise of a new world where justice will be fully realized. Enoch saw that, even though the world may be cloaked in the darkness of sin and evil, This fire will never cease, warming and guiding the righteous souls to eternal rest. The blazing flame is God's commitment that justice will ultimately prevail, and those who pursue truth and righteousness will be honored. Throughout his long journey, Enoch witnessed the destruction of evil forces, those who turned away from God, and ultimately the inescapable judgment. In Enoch's time, the evil spirits had forsaken justice, spreading chaos and sin throughout the world. They led mankind into corruption, disregarding all spiritual values and seeking only power and the satisfaction of their own desires. Yet, Enoch, in the wisdom bestowed upon him by God, witnessed the terrifying punishments that fell upon the sinners, those who had rejected righteousness. In his vision, Enoch not only witnessed the dreadful judgment, but also understood the importance of maintaining faith in God, preserving holiness, and adhering to the moral laws he had established from the beginning. From the story of Enoch, humanity in the modern world can learn the lesson of steadfastness in faith and vigilance against temptation. Just as in Enoch's time, today's society is rife with temptations, sin, and dark forces seeking to obscure the light of justice. In a world where justice is sometimes overlooked, where greed and selfishness overshadow compassion, the story of Enoch reminds us to remain alert and not to be drawn into wrongful deeds. Enoch was one who did not conform to the sinful society around him. He did not forsake his faith, even in the face of dark forces. Just as he did, people today must hold fast to moral values and remain steadfast in making righteous choices. Even if those choices lead to standing alone, justice will prevail, and God's judgment will come upon those who live in sin. Therefore, we must live uprightly, discerning between good and evil, and, most importantly, never turn our backs on God. One of the most important lessons Enoch learned and passed down to humanity was patience and faith and perseverance in the face of injustice and sin. From Enoch, we can learn how to maintain purity in our hearts, guard ourselves against temptation, and always pursue righteousness, regardless of the changes in the world around us. If humanity can learn from Enoch's story and apply these lessons to our lives, we can avoid the mistakes he witnessed in the past and live lives that are righteous, holy, and meaningful in the light of justice and righteousness. As Enoch stood amidst the majesty of the angels, surrounded by the radiant light of God, he was not only a witness but also the bearer of a great mission: to warn humanity of its inevitable collapse. In the visions he experienced, Enoch saw not only mysterious supernatural images, but also grasped the harsh truth of the widespread sin that had overtaken the earth. A great question arose in his mind. Could he prevent the destruction of mankind? Or was it all part of an unchangeable sequence of events predetermined by God's judgment? In Enoch's time, the earth was covered by wickedness and injustice. The fallen angels, known as the Watchers, had interacted with humanity and taught forbidden knowledge, leading mankind deeper into sin. From teaching magic to manipulating nature, their influence on humanity created a world steeped in irredeemable evil. Enoch, the only one chosen by God to witness these things, recognized the peril in their actions. However, even he had to face the truth that not all could be saved. In his mystical visions, Enoch saw both heaven and hell. He saw souls being punished for rejecting holiness and sinking into sin. These images not only reflected the judgment that God would bring upon the wicked, but also served as stern warnings to those who refused to turn back to the righteous path. Although Enoch pleaded with God for mercy, the destruction of mankind appeared to be an unavoidable fate. He realized that the fall of humanity was not something that could be averted by the strength of one man, even if that man was chosen by God. Yet, in these visions, Enoch also realized an important truth. Though he could not prevent the downfall of humanity, there was still one thing he could do: warn and pass on God's prophecy to those who remained. Those who listened and turned back to righteousness would be saved, but those who continued in sin would face destruction. This was Enoch's mission, not to prevent the collapse, but to deliver a message. Salvation was for those who maintained their faith and followed the righteous path of God. Therefore, the answer to the question of whether Enoch could prevent the fall of humanity is not a simple one. The destruction he witnessed was not an inevitable end, but a reflection of God's justice. Enoch was not merely a witness, but a messenger passing on an essential warning for future generations that humanity could avoid annihilation, but only if they returned to God, renounced sin, and lived in righteousness. As Enoch was led into the high realms of his visions, he beheld mysterious and somewhat terrifying images, one of which was the union of the waters above and the waters beneath, two opposing forces that harmonize in a miraculous event, signifying the eternal justice that God will execute upon humankind. This was not merely a metaphor, but a symbol of the inseparable relationship between the natural elements, the laws of the universe, and the administration of divine justice. What Enoch witnessed could explain the union of male and female, two fundamental elements of the universe, in the execution of divine justice. The waters above, an image often associated with purity and the omnipotence of God, were seen by Enoch in his exalted visions. These waters were not physical, the kind that humans can touch, but pure energy, representing God's presence, the reign of grace and justice. These waters not only covered the heavens and the earth, but also cleansed the defilement, marking the sign of purification and the resurrection of the human soul. When the waters above poured down, they were not merely a release of grace, but the connection between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm, a bond that could never be broken between God and humanity. In contrast, the waters beneath symbolized greed, sin, and the conflicts between the forces of evil. These were the waters of destruction, the vengeance of justice, where darkness and injustice prevailed. The waters beneath carried with them the relentless punishment for those who lived in sin, for those who refused to turn to the righteous path. The existence of the waters beneath was proof of the presence of iniquity and its consequences. So why was there a union between these two types of waters in the destruction of those who lived on earth? The answer lies in the harmony between the waters above and the waters beneath, which is the image of divine justice. Just as male and female are essential to creation and destruction, these two forces cannot be absent from the cosmic order. The waters above bring salvation and purification, while the waters beneath enact justice through punishment. Both have roles in maintaining the balance of the universe. The sacred must protect and purify the faithful, while iniquity must bear its deserved punishment. The image of male and female in divine justice can be understood as a metaphor for the union of these opposing forces. The male symbolizes creativity, energy, and the continual motion of the universe. The female represents fertility, nurturing, and the sustenance of all life. In their union, divine justice must preserve harmony between these two elements. Justice is not only judgment but also recreation, maintaining the cosmic order through purification and resurrection. When Enoch saw the union of the waters above and the waters beneath in his vision, he understood it as the symbol of the perfection of divine justice. The destruction of all who lived in sin was not merely annihilation, but a purification, preparing the way for a new world, a world free from iniquity, where only righteousness and hope remain in the light of God. It was at that moment that Enoch realized the relationship between male and female. The union of the waters above and the waters beneath was the manifestation of God's inseparable justice, a perfect equity in the universe. Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.